Welcome to the Sea of Startups, the show where Southeast Asia's startup game gets real. No pitch decks, no puff pieces, just unfiltered stories from the founders, funders, and operators building the region's future. In this second half of episode 4, we're moving from capital flows to compute infrastructure, from Jakarta's massive AI data center to Malaysia's sovereign startup ambition. It's the continuation of our deep dive into Southeast Asia's tech backbone, and a reminder that in this region, where the data goes often decides where the power lies. So let's pick up where we left off.
Next, the data center arm of UAE's DMAC Group has started building a colossal 2.3 billion AI-focused data center in Jakarta. And I can't emphasize more, but this thing is massive. Designed IT load of 144 megawatts. So, meaning it can power tons of high performance servers. And they broke ground after buying land just 4 months ago, March 2025, and they're aiming to get phase 1 operational by end of next year. So, what's your view, Kevin?
Yeah, they put it into part of the broader context because across Southeast Asia, we've been seeing a huge increase in investments in data centers. Basically, all your hyperscalers, whether you're talking about Microsoft, Google, AWS, everyone has been dumping a lot of money into the sector. And you have a lot of the names that you may not necessarily be as familiar with, but there's been a big, let's call it real estate move towards data centers, understanding that the demand for compute is just increasing.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing here is that is that designed IT load that this new one is going to be able to hold, where most of the ones that you see are on the much smaller size. And when I say much smaller size, maybe 10%, 20% the size of this massive one that they're planning. So it is definitely like, let's take a hyperscaler and put it on steroids, because there's going to be a huge surge in demand for AI compute. And so there's going to start being similar sort of moves across the region. So I think this is a space to watch out for. In a lot of the circles that I'm in, I hear more and more people talking about it, and a lot of people are interested in the full stack of investments that are going to end up having to come along with the increase in these data centers.
Yeah, exactly. And the founder of the Mac, Hussein Sajwani, he said the scale of AI workload demands a new class of infrastructure. So in other words, if everyone's developing AI, you need specialized facilities, and this Jakarta center will feature high density AI racks, and for those hot power hungry AI servers, and it's targeting a PUE of 1.32. In layman terms, what I'm trying to understand is that, which is quite efficient by global standards. And so they're emphasizing it's greenish and cutting edge, the way I see it.
Yeah, you kind of have to, because there's already data coming out in regards to some of the data centers in the US in regards to what percent of the grid power that they're starting to pull, and it's becoming massive. So we're going to end up having to see, as he said, a new class of infrastructure that is more efficient, because as demand comes along, we're either going to end up having to increase the amount of power production, which could end up being a lot less green, or we're going to have to figure out how to become much more efficient, because one way or another, power hungry is kind of an understatement. So it's certainly going to end up being a trend going forward. Is people are going to be talking much more about these efficiency metrics in regards to how data centers are operating, and that's going to be, as a lot of these have to solicit the governments, whether country governments or regional, local, they're going to likely end up having to talk about what the impact on the local electricity grid is and power consumption is going to end up being. So talking about these efficiency standards, certainly new class of infrastructure is definitely going to end up being demanded.
I mean, I sure hope it's going to be efficient, because all these data centers, they do have an impact on the environment. And being being where we are right now, which is quite close to the equator, it's not going to help us, right? It's just going to get hotter at this end of the world.
Yeah,
And
which they require a lot of cooling. So being in a
yeah,
tropical destination is probably not the best place to stay cool.
yeah, exactly. And anyway, so based on this, I guess Jakarta's appeal has pretty much grown, and Indonesia's digital economy is booming, and there's a push for data sovereignty. The government and major telcos want critical data and compute infrastructure in country, often called sovereign computer. And we have seen
Mm,
moves like Telkom Indonesia partnering with IBM on a sovereign AI cloud solution, and other Indonesian players launching AI infrastructure. So having a giant AI ready data center locally fits that agenda and keeps the data and the AI processing on Indonesian soil. It's a very strategic choice, and somehow or other it will all lead back to Singapore again. I guess you can say that Singapore is the Rome in this part of the world. All roads lead to Rome, and Southeast Asia's data centers gravitate to Singapore because of its stability, and it has good connectivity
yeah.
as well. Or maybe Malaysia, cheaper electricity. But I guess Jakarta is really getting a lot of heat.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to unpack here. Every country is now pushing more of this sovereign compute,
Yeah.
especially as more AI starts coming around. You're going to start seeing more data privacy, data protections, more involvement by policymakers, etc. So I think a lot of it because of the lead time in order to get these data centers up and operational. So you're already starting to see a lot of these players being kind of ahead of the game, like AWS, for example. I think they've committed like 6 billion in each and every single one of the Southeast Asian, the top six Southeast Asian countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines. It's basically across the board. And so I think you're going to start seeing a lot of these different plays being replicated
Mhm.
as that starts playing out.
Mhm.
I think the all roads lead back to Singapore is definitely true. Like there's this aspect, especially in Malaysia, where Johor is booming right now, and they did the special economic zone. They've done a few other sort of policy changes in order to try and create more bridge and cooperation with Singapore. And I think because there's much more abundance of land, so there is electricity, although there are some supply constraints on the electricity. The other key factor is water. I am quite curious because, as I learned, because I was
Mhm.
not aware previously, but during the pandemic, there was a lot of news stories about the export of water to Singapore coming out of
Yeah.
Malaysia.
Yeah.
And Malaysia actually started slowing that down, which started leaving a lot of thirsty people uh, down in Singapore. As the data center boom in Johor happens, that's going to put a lot more demand on water resources. And so there is a curious connection of what's that going to end up doing as all of a sudden they need to start running the calculation of the allocation of a finite resource of where is it going? Is it feeding my data centers that are now popping up in the southern state of Johor, or is it being exported to our southern neighbor? So certainly a number of things to think about, but without a doubt, the boom in data center is not slowing down. Global phenomenon. We're realizing it here in Southeast Asia, and it's just going to keep on picking up space because as AI just keeps on picking up, our demand for compute is just going to continue to skyrocket.
Yeah, and I hope the Johor and Malaysian government will be smart enough to actually use that to their advantage. Because if you really think about it, they talk about hydroelectric stuff, right? You can actually use water to power the grid. So hopefully there's some line of thinking that goes with that too. It's an arm race to provide the undersea cables, the data halls, and the server racks that tomorrow's tech like AI, IoT, 5G will run on. And Jakarta emerging as a hub is really notable. Perhaps it's a sign that Indonesia is giving its huge population and market needs its own regional hub. Although everything leads back to Singapore, I get it, but at the end of the day, physically it's an island. So I'm not throwing heat, okay? Don't come at me. But Singapore can't handle everything. It really can't. Singapore has that moratorium on new data centers for a while for environmental reasons. So investors look to neighboring countries. So people like us, I mean, we benefit from that. And plus, land and power are cheaper in Indo. And though one can't ignore the challenges, can Jakarta ensure reliable power and cooling for a 144 megawatt watt beast? They will likely have to if they're attracting AI workloads.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, Indonesia is a big startup ecosystem, and even though it kind of took the biggest hit as the bubble burst, with it's gonna end up being one of the primary startup ecosystems in Southeast Asia going forward. So the demand for compute is going to end up being there. As we're moving into this new era of technology, the same way that we invested in the prior infrastructure layers, electricity lines. Then we got into fiber optic or whatever other sort of cables that we were utilizing. This is just the new infrastructure play, and you actually see a lot of the really large private equity infrastructure players moving heavily into this space. So in the long term, we're going to end up starting to see a lot of this. In the short term, I hope this has residual direct benefits to startups. You're already starting to see a lot more, let's call it generosity of the startup programs that many of these hyperscalers are giving out. There's always been like the credit model that many of them have had, starting to be much more generous. It's starting to become more of like a battle for players to come onto their systems. And hopefully we'll start seeing the startup ecosystem benefit out of it.
And essentially, it's paving the way for the next gen of startups. And it's not just software and funding. You need these digital factories where computation happens. So think about a budding AI startup in Southeast Asia. Their computing needs can be huge. And if the region lacked that optimized data center, those startups would rely on distant cloud regions, which could be potentially suboptimal. And now with projects like this, they are the enablers putting in place locally. We talked about flyovers earlier, so it's like building highways before the cars arrive. And it aligns with the broader strategy of invest in tech infrastructure to future-proof the economy. Residual benefits will be gained. So that's definitely a story to watch. And now, from infrastructure bets to policy nudges. Our third big topic, Kevin, take us into Malaysia's recent moves to boost its startup ecosystem. What's that like?
Yeah, so there were basically three things that ended up getting talked about just recently. A few different initiatives. One was Jelawang Capital, which had previously been signaled. It was announced a long time ago, but they finally came out and announced their first set of VCs that they were investing in. You had them release a new set of VC tax incentives. This is not the first iteration, but it was a newly publicized promotion of it. And then you also have Cradle coming out with their Startup ASEAN regional program. All new announcements. They've been pushing the marketing channels on their efforts relatively recently, and they're trying to position Malaysia as a major hub for both VC and startup activity. I guess they see them trying to compete up with Singapore.
And okay, so let's start with the first part. So Jelawang, named after a waterfall, I believe, and it's quite poetic for a fun name. Give us the lowdown on Jelawang.
To be honest with you, I'm a bit cynical because
Yeah.
it's not the first time that Malaysia has tried to do this. What ended up happening was the prior iterations of their attempt to be a fund of funds for venture capital to inspire the ecosystem, they all got consolidated underneath Khazanah, the sovereign wealth fund. So these were MavCap, which was the original. It dates back some time, and then during the pandemic, they came out with another one that was called Pinjana.
Yeah.
Neither of them were effective. You can't really point to any of them as being success cases to model after. And so both of those ended up getting consolidated underneath Khazanah, and they came out with this new idea of wanting to do a new iteration of the fund of funds. It kind of seems like same playbook, new name, new slogan, new marketing, but let's just do more of the same as they've done in the past. You do the same thing. Are you really expecting to have a different result? So yeah, a bit cynical in regards to whether or not this is actually going to play out the way they think.
Right. And like I said, it's a form of rebranding, and time will only tell if it really works.
Hmm.
So I'm just going to leave that there and let the audience sit with that. And we can move on to the tax incentives. So they're basically telling VCs and PE folks, like, come here. Let us keep more of your profits, right?
Yeah, so this is not drastically different than the tax incentives that they put out a couple of years back. Basically, trying to put out concessionary taxes for the management companies and for the funds themselves. The tricky part on the funds themselves is that Malaysia has a zero capital gains tax rate. It seems like it's signaling that they're not going to treat carried interest as capital gains. So that's a bit of a question mark that I haven't had a chance to talk to a tax attorney, but it's probably something there. The flip side of that is there's probably not a lot of institutional investors that are going to domicile their actual fund in
Yeah.
Malaysia. So the applicability of this is probably pretty limited to the Malaysia only investor base. There may be something out of the Jelawang that we just talked about to where they want to have a Malaysia domicile. But as somebody that's actually had to go out and get institutional capital really only likes a handful of geographic destinations for being a fund domicile. And Malaysia's not on that list. You have places like Singapore, US Delaware, maybe a British Virgin Islands, Cayman, used to be Hong Kong before the geopolitics got in the way. But these are kind of like the standard sort of destinations, and Malaysia's not on that list. And so the applicability seems to be relatively limited. If I were them, I wouldn't be focusing so much on that component of it. What they can focus on is the tax incentive for the actual fund management entities. And the positive is that the last time that they came out with this, I gave a heavy criticism that it was originally intended for if they were investing solely in Malaysia. And there was a few different criteria that it was based on. And I basically came back and said, you should be focusing on percent of capital invested in Malaysia, not on other sort of factors, which is an easy one for them to come around on. I think that there's an advantage from a cost standpoint because simply from cost of headcount to have them in Malaysia, you can actually compete on where the management company is located at. You get cheaper rental space here than Singapore. You have a lower cost of headcount here, still cover the region. So there's some validity in making sense out of trying to incentivize the management companies. But this is something that's already been done in the past and it wasn't effective. So I was still is a little bit of a question mark of whether or not good intention is actually going to end up having positive result.
Yeah. And again, Malaysia is put in a spotlight whereby people are always take a step back and really just skeptical about the success of their initiatives.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll take something else that's recently in the news because they're flip-flopping around on SST in regards to adding new things into it. Like there is a trust factor involved, which I talked about when referencing Singapore, is that they have decades long of consistent, reliable rules, regulations, etc. Am I going to uproot and change the entire location of my team when maybe you get a change of heart next year and all of a sudden have flipped around what the rules of the game are? So there is quite a bit of a question mark in regards to that, and that it's hard for that not to come into play because if you're trying to lure foreign investors in, they're looking at it. They don't know you personally. All they're seeing is these sorts of data points of this, that, then back, then this, then back, then this. And you kind of look at it and you say, are you playing table tennis or are you playing policy regulations?
Yeah, it's a pretty much gray area, like the way how Malaysia operates. It's no fine line compared to its neighboring country, Singapore, whereby everything is just pretty much black and white. These are the rules. You're just gonna follow it, and that's it, straightforward. There's no wishy-washy around that. It's been a bit tricky to get things off the ground, and you really think about it, like even with these two programs that Jelawang has, the Emerging Managers Program, which fosters new local VCs, and the Regional Managers Initiative to bring in and collaborate with established regional VCs. And these five were chosen with a mix in local ones like Vin Capital and Kairos Capital. They are an interesting couple of regional players. AppWorks from Taiwan, First Move, which I think is Malaysian, but with a regional scope, and Granite Asia. Where's the play at really? And it kind of flows through the way things are done, like with tax incentives. You're trying to position Malaysia as a global competitive hub for venture and private capital, and even brag that KL has just entered top 20 in startup genomes emerging ecosystem ranking. It's all nice and dandy, but when it comes to the execution part, I'm aligned with you in terms of how well it can be done and how from Malaysia being in the bad books again. There have been so many news pieces. I'm not going to dive into that because I think we are way past that at this point. But it makes you wonder, like the succession of all this stuff, will it ever hit a point whereby finally Malaysia would gain some better news from these initiatives? And just a slight tangent there, but let's not forget about the third leg, the Cradle ASEAN platform and the broader regional play.
Yeah, yeah.
And Malaysia's the ASEAN chair in 2025. It's a good place to give Malaysia a stage to push regional startup integration.
Yeah, yeah. So I wish I could like switch off my cynical nature, but I've too much experience with this organization. The challenge across the board with this is that there's a lot of good intention coming down from the top, but where it's always stumbled at is translating that into execution and action, and actually getting our ROI on these initiatives. Because as I've already said, none of the stuff that they're trying to do is new. They've done it before. Every single one of these initiatives, with the exception of this ASEAN one, because that's new. But they're basically trying to replicate the playbook that they did domestically and do it at an ASEAN level. But it didn't work out at the national level. And so, like, what are they actually trying to do here is a bit of a question mark, because they basically put kind of I'll call it sloppy, a kind of a sloppy platform together that is not super useful. I don't know who they had design it. Now they're going to try and roll it up because they're the ASEAN chair and try and do something at the ASEAN level. At the surface level, if you're sitting up way up at the top, you're like, yeah, let's take a leadership role. Let's create more of a brand for the country to kind of step into a leadership role.
Yeah.
But if you're down on the details, the Startup Genome Report, I don't know any practitioner that actually follows that or believes that the results accurately reflect the rankings across ASEAN. A lot of their ratings are based upon factors like policy and all of that. And in all honesty, like, Malaysia is quite good from a ease of doing business and policy standpoint. If you start comparing it to a Vietnam or an Indonesia, you have less red tape, less bureaucracy, less of these problems. But you also have a lot less of a startup ecosystem. And so how does this higher ranking actually connect into what the actual startup ecosystem it truly is on the ground? And so that kind of ties back into a lot of this. Like, I know good people that are in many of these different organizations that are here that really intend well, but like the leadership across these organizations, you can't find one person that has an understanding of startups. That not one person that actually came from startup ecosystem, startup founder, startup investor. You just don't find anybody that actually has a relevancy of knowledge or experience in them. And the challenge that probably is related to the aspect of why they're oftentimes trying to start on step 3 without accomplishing step 1 and 2. And so with many of this, when I start questioning whether or not they're going to end up being effective, often it's kind of coming back to, are we actually doing the thing that matters for today, or are we just having like these nice intentions and let's get some marketing buzz as opposed to a real ROI?
Um, I think at this point it's well understood among investors and policymakers, people who are not within the Malaysian ecosystem, to have that skepticism, because of the way things have been and are right now. But I think perhaps I'm just going to say this. I'm just going to give them benefit of the doubt and let it be. Let's see how it goes. To their own credit, right? It's a smart move. If you can't beat Singapore 1-1, you can broaden the playing field. So I guess that's where they're taking it, from a leadership position and becoming the champion of the whole region's integration. And that gives Malaysia some edge and possibly first leaps on regional initiatives. And who knows, it could funnel more regional activity through KL, for example, like if the startup ASEAN platform matches startup to investors and it runs out of Malaysia, and Malaysian ecosystems might get more visibility and role. So it's it's a ripple effect. It's soft power. Yeah, I am hopeful, potentially real economic gain if more regional funds and startups engage with Malaysia as a hub. It sounds great. I mean, money, tax breaks, big programs. Given where Malaysia is at right now, is that a point of human capital and network effects. So Singapore has a dense network of investors, mentors, multinational HQs. And Malaysia can't conjure that overnight with money alone. And there's also that political will. Now, that is a tricky part, right? Will this incentive survive if there's a change in government or priorities? Sustained effort is key. And over the last few years, at least since 2018, there have been 2 rounds of government changes. So again, that is already impacting the startup ecosystem in Malaysia. So I'm just making comparisons to Singapore's EDB, and agencies have been investing VCs and co-investing in startups for decades. And in going over to the Middle East, whereby Saudi Arabia's PIF is now plowing billions into local startups and global funds to create a tech hub in Riyadh. Results are unknown, but they've still got big pockets. And India's SIDBI Fund of Funds launched in 2016 and is often cited as a success. So all these examples, if they are done right, a fund of funds can actually work. And the India example is encouraging, although true, India's market is huge and timing was good. But for Malaysia, maybe a realistic hope is to significantly boost that 429 million figure. If in a couple of years they're doing $1 billion a year startup funding, that's going to be a big win.
I know, hopefully there is something there. I would love to jump on the bandwagon of Optimus, because I do think that Malaysia has the enabling characteristics to be a number 2 startup ecosystem. I don't know whether or not we can necessarily dethrone Singapore, because it's kind of entrenched itself as the financial capital of the region. But it does certainly have the enabling characteristics to where it could be a number 2. And when I arrived in the region, it was actually number 2. But I've watched it fall from like a number 2 all the way down to where it's essentially lost a lot of that ground. And largely, it's not like any of these programs didn't exist during those years of that decline. They were all there. They were all doing a lot of this stuff. So I'm optimistic, because I do think that the startups deserve it, and that there is a lot of that capability. They're basically doing a lot of the same things with new slogan. I think the proof is in the pudding in regards to we have to wait and see where the ROI is. I hope it works out, but again, history may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. If you do the same things, it's hard to expect a different result.
Yeah. There's a bit of catch up and maybe defensive play here. Like, I'm just going to add on a bit of context. So like in the past couple of years, like Indonesia and Vietnam were grabbing a lot of investor attention due to huge markets, and Singapore entrenched itself as a financial hub. And over the years, Malaysia has risked being overlooked. It's pretty much like Malaysia's kind of the middle child of ASEAN startups. Not as a large market as Indonesia, not as rich as Singapore, and it needs to hustle to really attract attention. And these moves are that hustle. And I must say, the coordination of multiple initiatives, funds, tax, regional platform, it's commendable. It's fairly comprehensive. It's an attempt to stay relevant in the regional startup race. And if they follow through over the next 5 to 10 years, we might look back at 2025 being the turning point where KL became a significant startup hub. So part of me feels hopeful about that. I really hope so.
Hopefully.
Or worst case scenario, if it fizzles, it'll be a case study in, oh my gosh, well-intentioned but insufficient policy. And we'll definitely keep an eye, I guess. Maybe in a future episode we'll report on did Malaysia's big startup push pay off or not. I don't know. I mean, it's a bold gambit, right? We've touched on a lot of core topics this round. Yeah. And it's been a
Yeah, I
journey.
mean, exactly. I think common thread is where's the money moving? We're seeing in the data in regards to startup activity and the whole AI data sensors. Hopefully, some of these policy channels. Every government has their own initiatives, this and that. We talked about what Malaysia is doing. Hopefully it works out. I've got a healthy dose of skepticism, but one thing's for certain: I think Southeast Asia's tech scene is evolving on multiple fronts, and I think there's definitely a maturation that's going on. I'm net bullish, even though I have the cynicism, but there's a lot to keep our eyes on.
And talk about seeing the tech ecosystem from all angles. It's all encompassing. And before we sign off, a quick call to action for our listeners. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to Sea of Startups on your favorite podcast platform. We are on Apple, we're on Spotify. We have lots more coming, and we don't want you to miss out.
And do rate and review us. A 5-star review or a short review goes a long way to help others discover the podcast. So please, it gives us feedback, helps us improve. Let us know.
And share this episode with a friend or a colleague interested in Asian tech, especially if they think all the big action is only in Silicon Valley. It's not. Haha. We are here to show that Southeast Asia has its own thrilling saga unfolding. Literally. And speaking of untold stories, in the next episode, we head to the Philippines. Kevin sits down with Joseph De Leon, angel investor, strategist, and ecosystem whisperer, for real talk on ambition, investing, and the billion-dollar gap no one's solving yet. Hit follow, and we'll see you there. Peace out for now.